The cold in southern Minnesota in November of 1886 was not a warning. It was a statement. By the third week of the month, the ground had already locked solid 2 inches deep, and the birch trees along the creek bottom cracked in the night like rifle shots. In the small homestead cluster scattered across the valley between Mankato and New Ulm, families were stacking wood, checking chimney mortar, and pulling livestock into whatever shelter they had built over the summer. Most of them had learned, after 1 or 2 hard winters, that the difference between comfort and suffering came down to preparation measured in cords of dry oak and inches of wall insulation. On the eastern edge of one such settlement, a loose gathering of perhaps 30 families along a creek known locally as Keller's Run, a widow named Marta Voss was doing something her neighbors found strange. She wasn't just stacking wood. She was nailing scrap lumber to the south wall of her cabin, not building an addition, not a proper lean-to with squared corners and plain boards. Something rougher, something that, from the road, looked like a mistake in progress. Marta had arrived from Bavaria 2 years earlier with her late husband, Heinrich, who had died of fever in the summer of 1885 before he had finished the cabin's second interior wall. She was 41 years old, spoke careful but accented English, and owned 11 chickens, a milk cow, a hand plow, and a woodpile that would not last a winter. She knew it, and she had already done the arithmetic. What nobody on that road understood, not yet, was that the strange structure growing against her south wall wasn't a mistake. It was the beginning of an answer to a problem most of her neighbors hadn't even clearly named yet. If you want to learn one lost frontier technique every week, techniques that worked when everything else failed, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Every video on this channel is built on real history, real numbers, and real code. You won't find this in any textbook. Now let's get into it. Marta Voss was not an inventor. She was a woman trying to keep her animals alive through a Minnesota winter on a budget that left no margin for error. Each chicken she lost was not just a dead bird. It was fewer eggs through spring, less food on the table, and less small income from selling a dozen eggs to the general store in town every 2 weeks. She couldn't afford to lose them. The previous winter, she had lost 4. They had frozen in the small detached coop Heinrich had built. A simple structure, pine board with gaps between them, straw on the floor, no heat source. On the coldest nights, when temperatures dropped below -10 degrees Fahrenheit, -23 degrees Celsius, the birds simply couldn't generate enough collective warmth to survive. She had found them stiff in the morning, feathers puffed out and useless. So in October of 1886, she decided to move the coop closer to the cabin. Her original intention was simply to rebuild it against the north wall, where it would be shielded from the prevailing winds. But when she began pulling up the old coop's frame boards and carrying them toward the cabin, she paused. The south wall, the wall that faced the weak autumn sun, was noticeably warmer to the touch than the others. Even in October, the afternoon light had been working on that dark, weathered pine for hours each day, and the logs beneath retained some of that warmth well into evening. She pressed her palm flat against the south wall and held it there. Then she pressed her other hand against the north wall. The difference was at least several degrees. She stood there for a moment in the pale afternoon light, thinking. She didn't move the coop to the north side. She built against the south wall instead. It wasn't a plan. It was an observation followed by a decision. The kind of decision that tired, practical people make when they can't afford to be wrong. She used the salvaged pine boards, a length of old canvas, sod blocks cut from the creek bank, and leftover fieldstone to assemble a low structure, barely 5 feet tall at its peak, pressed directly against the cabin's south-facing logs. The shared wall between cabin and coop was solid stone and mortar, about 14 inches thick, left over from Heinrich's original hearth construction. She put her 11 chickens inside, spread a thick layer of dry straw on the floor, and went back to her other chores. She didn't tell anyone what she had noticed about the wall. There was nothing to tell yet. But 3 nights later, when she pressed her hand against the interior cabin wall, where the coop sat just on the other side, she felt it again, a warmth that had no business being there. The stove hadn't been burning for 2 hours. The room should have been cooling rapidly. And yet, that south wall was holding something. She didn't fully understand the physics, but she understood what her hand was telling her. To anyone passing on the road, Marta's structure looked like a hasty and elegant patch-up, and in some ways it was. But inside that roughness was a set of physical principles that passive solar engineers would recognize instantly today, even if the woman who built it had never heard those words. Here is what she actually constructed, and why each element mattered. The shared stone partition. The wall between the coop and the cabin interior was approximately 14 inches of stacked limestone and mortar, the same stone Heinrich had used for the hearth foundation. Stone of this density acts as what modern building science calls thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. During the day, the chicken's body heat, and any sunlight entering through the coop's small south-facing gap, was absorbed by that stone wall. At night, when temperatures outside dropped sharply, the stone released that stored warmth back into the cabin interior. Not a burst of heat, but a slow, steady radiation. The wall became, in effect, a battery, charged during the day, discharging through the night. To put numbers on it, a chicken at rest produces somewhere between 8 and 12 BTUs of heat per hour. 11 chickens running continuously represent between 88 and 132 BTUs per hour. Modest by modern standards, but in a confined, insulated space pressed against a stone wall meaningful. Over 16 hours of overnight cold. That totals between 1,400 and 2,100 BTUs transferred into the stone mass. A standard candle produces roughly 80 BTUs per hour. Marta's chickens were effectively burning the equivalent of 17 to 26 candles against that wall every single night. The sod outer shell. She packed cut sod blocks, dense prairie turf, roots intact, roughly 4 to 6 inches thick, along the outer face of the coop's east and west sides and across most of the roof. Sod is an exceptional insulator. The dense root matrix traps air, resists wind penetration, and has an R value estimated between R1 and R2 per inch, comparable to loose fill insulation. Stacked 4 to 6 inches deep, her sod shell added between R4 and R12 to the coop's exterior. More importantly, it stopped wind-driven cold from reaching the pine boards beneath, elevated flooring, and deep straw bedding. She set the coop floor on short limestone blocks, raising it approximately 6 inches off the ground. This gap broke the direct thermal bridge between the frozen earth and the floorboards. Cold ground conducts heat away from warm spaces with remarkable efficiency. Breaking that contact, even partially, reduced floor-level heat loss significantly. She then laid 12 inches of dry straw on top, not just for chicken's comfort, but because compressed dry straw behaves like a rough insulating blanket, trapping the birds' body heat near floor level where they roost. The ventilation gap. This detail is what separated her design from a sealed trap. She left a narrow horizontal gap, approximately 2 inches, near the top of the coop's south-facing wall, covered loosely with double canvas. This allowed moisture-laden air from the chicken's breathing and manure to escape upward and outward, preventing the humidity buildup that would have, over time, rotted her wall boards and eventually introduced dampness into the cabin logs. She didn't know the term vapor diffusion, but she had seen what happened to wetwood left against the wall. She made sure the moisture had somewhere to go. The result was a closed-loop thermal system. The chickens generated heat, the sod shell contained it, the stone wall absorbed it, and the cabin received it slowly through the night. Nothing exotic, nothing that required imported materials or specialized skills. Just an understanding, intuitive, practical, earned, of how heat moves, where it goes, and how to slow it down. Word spreads in small settlements the way cold does, silently, through every gap. By late November of 1886, most of the families along Keller's Run had seen or heard about Marta's strange south wall structure. Reactions were consistent. Amusement, mild concern, and the particular skepticism that small communities reserve for someone doing something visibly different. The feed store operator, a man named Callum Bright who had been supplying the valley for 11 years, stopped his wagon on the road one afternoon and looked at the structure for a long moment. He had seen a lot of improvised construction in his years. The moisture off them birds will be in her wall logs by spring, he said to the man riding with him. She'll have rot by the second winter. He clicked his tongue and moved on. He wasn't cruel about it. He was simply certain. The woman on the neighboring homestead to the east, a practical and well-regarded figure named Mrs. Elspeth Dower, came by to bring a jar of preserved plums in early December and stood in Marta's front room with a politely neutral expression. She could smell the faint warm straw and bird smell through the interior wall. "I don't know how you stand it," she said, not unkindly. "My Lars would never." She meant no harm. She left the plums and walked home. But the comment that stuck, the one that local oral accounts preserved in enough variations to suggest it really was said, or something close to it, came from a carpenter named Theodore Rask. Rask had built more structures in that valley than any other man, and he carried the authority of someone whose work had survived 3 hard winters without a failure. He rode past Marta's homestead on his way back from a framing job, stopped, studied the lean-to coop for a full minute, and said, loud enough to be heard from a road, "That's not a house. That's a bar with pretensions, and the barn's going to win." He rode on. The men with him laughed. Marta, who had been splitting kindling 30 feet away, said nothing. She went back to splitting kindling. She had 11 living chickens in November. That was more than she'd had at that point the previous year. The wall behind them was warm to the touch every morning. She didn't need Rask's approval. She needed to survive February. January of 1887 arrived without negotiation. Meteorological records from stations across the upper Midwest document what settlers along Keller's Run experienced firsthand. A high-pressure Arctic system descended over Minnesota in the second week of January and simply stayed. Temperatures dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius on January 12th. By the 14th, they had reached minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius. They did not recover above 0 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 18 degrees Celsius for 11 consecutive days. This was not an ordinary cold snap. This was the kind of cold that made the air feel solid, that turned exhale breath into ice crystals before it dispersed, that froze the water in a bucket left by the stove overnight. Livestock deaths were reported across 3 counties. 2 families in the broader New Ulm area, according to contemporary accounts in the local newspaper, burned furniture when their wood piles ran out. A family 4 miles north of Keller's Run lost their entire pig enclosure. Not the animals, they survived, but the structure itself collapsed under the ice load on the roof. Along the Run, the pattern was the same in nearly every cabin. The stove ran continuously day and night. Men were waking at 2 and 4 in the morning to feed the fire. Wood piles that had looked adequate in December were having by the end of the first week. One family, the Brenners, who had 7 children in a cabin on the north end of the settlement, sent their eldest son to Callum Bright's store to ask about purchasing additional cordwood on credit, only to find that Bright's own supply of pre-split drywall was nearly exhausted. Chimneys that had been only marginally functional became serious problems. A draft that seemed acceptable in October, when temperature differentials were modest, became dangerously inadequate at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius. 3 families along the Run dealt with smoke backing into their cabins. Not enough to be life-threatening, but enough to make the air inside gritty and the eyes water continuously. Marta Voss fed her stove twice a day, morning and evening. She slept through the night. Stay with me until the end of this video, because the number that came out of that cabin, when someone finally went in and measured, silenced every argument that had been made against her. Every single one. It was Lars Dower, Elspeth's husband, the man who would never tolerate the smell, who first walked into Marta's cabin during the cold stretch on the morning of January 17th, after 9 consecutive days below 0. He came to check on her. She was a widow alone, and whatever he thought of her construction choices, he was a decent man. He knocked. She let him in, and he stood in her front room and felt something he had not felt in 9 days. Warmth that didn't come from standing directly next to the stove. He looked at the stove. The firebox held a modest bed of coals, no active flame. He had left his own cabin with the stove burning hard, and his front room had been 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius when he stepped out. He looked at Marta and asked if he could use the small thermometer she kept on the shelf, a simple mercury instrument Heinrich had brought from Germany, used for checking fermentation temperatures in the cold cellar. He placed it on the table, away from the stove and away from the shared wall with the coop. They waited 4 minutes. It read 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius. He pressed his palm against the south wall, the limestone partition behind which the chickens were roosting. It was distinctly warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable. Warm, the way a stone hearth feels 2 hours after the fire has died down. He held his hand there and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked Marta how much wood she had burned in the past 9 days. She took him to the woodpile. He looked at what was missing, roughly 1.5 phase cord of split oak and ash. He did the arithmetic against his own consumption. He had burned through nearly 3.5 phase cords in the same period, in a cabin of comparable size, running his stove through the night. He had also lost 1 chicken to the cold, and was not entirely certain his second one had survived. The comparison, when he put it plainly, Marta's cabin interior held between 49 degrees Fahrenheit and 53 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 to 12 degrees Celsius, overnight without a running fire. His cabin dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius to 0 degrees Celsius, with a continuously burning stove. She had burned approximately 40% less wood over the 9-day period. The south limestone wall maintained a surface temperature of no less than 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, confirmed by multiple morning readings with a small thermometer, while exterior temperatures held at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius, or colder. Her 11 chickens were alive. All of them. They had not required supplemental heating of any kind. None of this was sorcery. The physics were straightforward, even if nobody along the run had assembled them in this particular way before. The chickens produced low-grade but continuous heat. The sod shell on the coop's exterior prevented that heat from simply escaping into the night air. The limestone wall between the coop and the cabin absorbed that accumulated warmth and released it slowly, the way any dense, heavy material does when it stores thermal energy. The elevated floor and deep straw had reduced ground cold penetration enough that the birds stayed healthy and productive. Every piece of the system reinforced every other piece. What Marta had built was, in modern terminology, a passive thermal buffer zone, a warm intermediate space attached to a conditioned interior using biological heat generation and thermal mass storage to reduce heating demand. Architects today call this a sun space or thermal envelope addition when they design it intentionally. In 1886, on a limited budget with salvaged materials, a Bavarian widow had arrived at the same principle through observation and necessity. Lars Dower walked home and told his wife what the thermometer had read. Elspeth Dower, to her credit, did not say anything dismissive. She asked how thick the stone wall was. The Arctic system broke in the 3rd week of January 1887. Temperatures climbed back above freezing by February's first days, and the valley exhaled. Fences were checked, livestock losses tallied, wood piles measured against what remained of the winter. The accounting was uncomfortable for several families. Lars Dower did not make an announcement. He did not write to the newspaper or stand up at the church meeting and declare that the widow Voss had solved something. He simply, in March of 1887, began attaching his chicken enclosure to the south wall of his own barn, the wall that shared a surface with the barn's interior where he kept his 2 milk cows. He used fieldstone from the creek, sod from the lower pasture, and pine boards he had milled the previous summer. He did not ask Marta's permission or advice, though she could see what he was doing from her property. She said nothing. Callum Bright, the feed store operator who had predicted rot in her wall logs, inspected Marta's south wall in April of 1887 when she came in for seed corn. He asked, with professional directness, whether she had seen any moisture damage or soft spots in the logs where Coop abutted. She told him the logs were dry. He nodded slowly and did not bring it up again. Theodore Rask, the carpenter who had delivered the barn with pretensions verdict from the road, did not apologize. But oral accounts from the settlement, recorded decades later in the county history compiled in the 1920s, note that Rask began recommending animal heat integration as an optional feature in the small outbuildings he designed for clients, particularly for coops or goat pens attached to south or west-facing walls. He called it a thermal adjacency, a phrase he appeared to have coined himself and was not inclined to attribute elsewhere. By the winter of 1888 to 1889, informal accounts suggest that at least 11 homesteads within a reasonable radius of Keller's Run had incorporated some version of an attached animal enclosure against a primary living space wall. Not always chickens, not always stone partitions, but always with the same underlying intention. Use the animal's body heat. Slow its escape. Let the shared wall carry it inward. Some used double-walled pine with sawdust fill instead of sod. Some used a small goat pen rather than a chicken coop. One family, whose cabin sat at the base of a north-facing ridge with no direct winter sun, used a combined root cellar and rabbit hutch against their west wall to achieve a similar effect. Nobody called any of these things revolutionary. Nobody held a meeting. The idea spread the way genuinely useful ideas spread in rural communities. One neighbor watched another, asked a practical question, got a practical answer, and adapted it to their own materials and situation. Marta Voss sold eggs through the spring of 1887 at a rate that let her purchase 2 additional cords of wood before the following October, meaning she entered the winter of 1887 to 1888 with a surplus she had never had before. She also had 14 chickens by then. She had added 3 more in the fall, specifically to increase the heat generation inside the coop. There is no record of her explaining this calculation to anyone, but the expanded coop section, a second sod-covered bay, pressed further along the south wall, was visible from the road by September. She knew what she was doing. She had known for a year. What Marta Voss built along Keller's Run in the autumn of 1886 was not an invention. It was a rediscovery, or perhaps more accurately, an independent convergence with principles that human beings have understood and applied for a very long time. The integration of animal heat into human living spaces is older than written records of it. Scandinavian farm structures, particularly the longhouse tradition that persisted in Norway and Iceland well into the 19th century, routinely housed cattle and people under the same roof, with the animal's body heat providing measurable warmth to the human living quarters. The fjøs, the animal byre attached to the Icelandic bastofa, was not primitive cohabitation. It was deliberate thermal engineering. Estonian and Latvian farmsteads of the same era used the same logic. So did certain alpine communities across Austria and the Tyrol, where animals and families shared connected structures specifically because the heat exchange was understood to cut winter fuel consumption. What the experts of Keller's Run, Rask, Bright, the experienced men of the valley, had missed was not a technical secret. It was a question they had never thought to ask. Where's the heat going, and is there a way to slow it down? Most frontier construction of the 1880s was built around the assumption that the stove was the sole heat source, and that the goal was simply to build walls tight enough to keep that heat from escaping too quickly. The animal enclosure in that framework was always a separate structure, because mixing livestock in living spaces was considered unclean, unfamiliar, and vaguely embarrassing. Cultural expectations had overridden thermal logic. Marta, newly arrived from a region where integrated farmhouse construction was not unusual, didn't carry that assumption. She saw a warm wall and followed it. The physical principle she was working with, thermal mass storage, requires no special materials and no sophisticated tools. Dense materials like stone, brick, and rammed earth absorb heat energy when the surrounding temperature is higher than their own temperature and release it when the surrounding temperature drops below theirs. They act as thermal flywheels, smoothing out the peaks and valleys of fire's cycle and extending the effective warmth of any heat source. A 14-inch limestone wall adjacent to a continuously occupied and heated chicken coop in a well-insulated enclosure can store enough thermal energy over a 16-hour day to meaningfully offset nighttime heat loss. In an adjacent room, this is not a miracle. It is basic heat transfer, conduction through the stone, slow release through the night. It works because stone has a high volumetric heat capacity. It has worked for as long as people have built with stone and kept animals. And it continues to work today in passive solar homes, earth-sheltered buildings, and rocket mass heaters, all of which apply variants of the same logic. What made Marta's solution remarkable was not that she discovered something new. It was that she arrived at something old through direct observation, in a context where the people around her had forgotten to look. She was practical where they were conventional. She was curious where they were certain. And when the thermometer read 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, on the coldest morning of one of the worst cold stretches Minnesota had recorded in a decade, the question of who had been right answered itself without anyone needing to say a word. The cold doesn't care about reputations. It only measures what you actually built. That's the story of Marta Voss and the coop that kept her warm, and eventually kept her neighbors warm too, whether they admitted it or not. If this kind of history, real techniques, real code, real people who figured things out without a manual, is what you're looking for, Subscribe right now. Every week, we bring you one more story from the frontier that the textbooks left out. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever had to survive? I read every single one.